The 17th of March 1943, Mid-Atlantic, 47 degrees north, 29 degrees west. The sea was ink, no moon, no stars, just the slow, suffocating roll of the Atlantic in darkness so complete it felt like burial at sea while still breathing. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann stood in the conning tower of U-221, salt crusting his beard, the stench of diesel and unwashed men rising from the hatch below. The wind was a low moan across the water. For 2 years, this darkness had been sanctuary. For 2 years, the night belonged to the wolf packs. But tonight, something was wrong. Hartmann felt it before he understood it, a tightness in his chest, a prickling along his neck. The hydrophone operator had reported nothing. The lookouts saw nothing. The sea was empty, vast, indifferent. Yet every instinct honed by 30 months of war whispered a single word: run. He raised his binoculars and scanned the horizon. Black on black, the kind of invisibility that had sent 200 Allied merchant ships to the bottom in the last 8 weeks alone, the kind of darkness that had made men like him legends. Then the sky opened. Not with thunder, not with lightning, with light, cold, blinding, unnatural dropping from the clouds like the hand of an angry god, a parachute flare, American. And in that instant, as the ocean turned silver and the U-boat stood naked on the surface, Werner Hartmann understood that the war he had known was over. To understand what happened in that moment, to grasp the shock that froze Hartmann's blood and would soon freeze the blood of every U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine, you must first understand what the Atlantic had been. You must go back to the beginning, to the dark days when Germany held the sea in its fist and Britain starved. September 1939. The war was 8 days old when Oberleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, commanding U-30, put a torpedo into the British liner Athenia off the coast of Ireland. 117 people died, including 28 Americans. It was a mistake. Lemp thought she was an armed merchant cruiser, but it set the tone. The Atlantic was now a killing ground, and the U-boats were its reapers. In the first 4 months of war, they sank 114 ships. By the summer of 1940, with France fallen and Germany controlling the entire western coastline of Europe from Norway to Spain, the U-boat fleet had what its commanders called happy time. Convoys crawled across the Atlantic like wounded animals, and the wolves tore them apart. The numbers were staggering. In October 1940 alone, U-boats sank 63 ships, 352,000 tons of steel, fuel, food, and hope sent to the bottom. The convoys had escorts, yes, British destroyers and corvettes straining to protect 40, 50, sometimes 60 merchant ships strung out across miles of ocean. But the sea was too vast, the escorts too few, and the U-boats had a weapon the Allies could not counter: invisibility. A submarine on the surface at night was nearly impossible to detect. Radar was primitive, line of sight only. Sonar was useless against a surfaced target. The human eye, straining into darkness, was all the Allies had, and the human eye could not see far enough. So the U-boats hunted on the surface, running ahead of convoys at 15 knots, faster than any merchant ship and nearly as fast as the escorts. They attacked at night, slipping between the columns of ships, firing torpedoes at point-blank range, then vanishing into the darkness before the escorts could respond. The Wolfpack tactics, Rudeltaktik, perfected by Admiral Karl Dönitz, turned the mid-Atlantic into a graveyard. The Black Pit, sailors called it. That gap in the middle of the ocean, 1,000 miles from any airfield, where no land-based aircraft could reach, and the convoys travelled alone. By 1942, the slaughter had reached industrial scale. In the first 6 months of that year, U-boats sank 585 ships. In November alone, 117 ships went down 743,000 tons. The math was simple and terrifying. Britain imported 50 million tons of supplies a year to survive. If the sinking rate continued, she would be starved into surrender by the end of 1943. Churchill would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." For the men in the U-boats, those years felt like triumph. They were the elite volunteers all, trained to the edge of human endurance, living in steel tubes 60 meters long and 6 meters wide, breathing recycled air thick with diesel fumes and the sweat of 50 men who did not bathe for 8 weeks at a stretch. They ate canned meat and mouldy bread. They slept in shifts, hot bunking in spaces so cramped a man could not stand upright. They endured depth charges that shook the boat like a toy, crushing the hull inward, popping rivets, shattering gauges, sending men to their knees in prayer or madness. And yet they returned to port as heroes, riding into Lorient or Saint-Nazaire with pennants flying for every ship killed, greeted by Admiral Dönitz himself, awarded iron crosses and oak leaves and swords, their photographs in the papers, their names whispered with awe. They believed they were winning. They believed the Atlantic was theirs. They were about to learn otherwise. The change did not announce itself. It crept in slowly, like fog, across the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943. At first, it was just odd occurrences, small things, troubling things. Korvettenkapitän Reinhard Hardigan, commander of U-123, one of the most successful aces in the fleet with 20 ships to his name, reported it first in January 1943. He had surfaced at night to charge batteries, standard procedure, safe procedure, or so it had always been. The night was overcast, visibility near zero. His lookouts saw nothing. His hydrophones heard nothing. Then, without warning, an American Liberator bomber roared out of the clouds at 300 feet, searchlight blazing, and dropped 4 depth charges in a bracket so precise it seemed impossible. U-123 crash-dived, survived by seconds, limped back to port with a cracked pressure hull. Hardigan's report was stark. "The aircraft found us in total darkness with no visual reference. I believe they have a new detection method." He was right. What Hardigan did not know, what none of the U-boat commanders knew in those early months, was that the Americans and British had deployed a revolution. Not a single weapon, but a cascade of technologies, tactics, and industrial might that would, in the span of 6 months, turn the Atlantic from a German lake into a death trap. The first piece was radar, not the clumsy, short-range sets of 1940, but centimetric radar, 10-centimeter wavelength, small enough to fit in an aircraft, powerful enough to detect a submarine's conning tower from 10 miles away in complete darkness. The British had invented it in 1940, refining the cavity magnetron at the University of Birmingham, a device so secret that when the Tizard mission carried it to America in September 1940, it was guarded like the crown jewels. The Americans, with their vast industrial capacity, turned it from a laboratory curiosity into a weapon of war. By early 1943, hundreds of Allied patrol aircraft, Liberators, Sunderlands, Catalinas carried the new radar. They could find a U-boat on the surface at night, in fog, in storm. The darkness was no longer sanctuary. The darkness was transparent. The second piece was the ley light. Captain Humphrey de Vere de Ley, a British eccentric, had proposed it in 1940. A powerful searchlight mounted under an aircraft's wing, slaved to the radar, switched on at the last second to blind the U-boat crew and illuminate the target for bombing. The Admiralty ignored him for a year. Then the losses mounted, and desperation made visionaries of bureaucrats. By mid-1942, ley light-equipped aircraft were hunting the Bay of Biscay, the narrow waters U-boats had to cross to reach the Atlantic. The boats that had once surfaced with impunity to recharge batteries now found themselves pinned by light, bombed, strafed, sent to the bottom before they could dive. The third piece was the destroyer escort, the DE, in U.S. Navy parlance. Small, cheap, mass-produced warships designed for one purpose: killing submarines. The Americans built them by the dozen, then by the score, then by the 100. They were crude compared to fleet destroyers, slower, less armed, uncomfortable, but they had sonar, depth charges, and endurance. Most importantly, they had numbers. By the spring of 1943, a convoy that once had 3 escorts now had 10. A U-boat that surfaced to attack found itself hunted by a swarm. The fourth piece was intelligence. The Allies had broken the German naval Enigma code in mid-1941, a triumph of mathematics and stolen hardware achieved by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. By 1943, they were reading Dönitz's orders to his wolf packs in near real time, rerouting convoys around the patrol lines, vectoring escort groups onto U-boats before the U-boats even knew the convoys were near. The hunters had become the hunted, and they did not know why. The fifth piece was the escort carrier, the CVE, a small aircraft carrier built on a merchant ship hull, slow and ungainly but capable of carrying 24 aircraft into the middle of the Atlantic. They closed the Black Pit. Now, there was no gap, no safe zone. Every convoy had air cover. Every square mile of ocean could be patrolled. And the sixth piece, the terrible piece, the piece that bound all the others together and made them unstoppable, was American industrial production. In 1942, the United States launched 8 million tons of new shipping, more than the U-boats sank that year. In 1943, the figure would be 12 million tons. The Germans were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. Yes, but they were not sinking ships faster than America could build them. Dönitz needed to sink 700,000 tons a month to win the tonnage war. By May 1943, his U-boats were sinking 250,000 tons a month and losing boats at a rate that would annihilate the fleet within a year. But in March 1943, Werner Hartmann did not know any of this. He only knew the light. The flare hung in the sky, swaying beneath its parachute, turning night into noon. Hartmann screamed the order, "Alarm!" and the lookouts tumbled down the hatch, boots clanging on steel, and the diving klaxon shrieked, and the vents opened, and the sea poured into the ballast tanks with a roar like a waterfall. U-221 nose down, the deck tilting, the conning tower sinking, the cold Atlantic reaching for Hartmann's boots as he dropped through the hatch and slammed it shut and dogged the wheel. The boat groaned, creaked, plunged, 20 meters, 30, 50. Above, they heard the aircraft. The deep, droning thunder of 4 engines, a Liberator. It passed overhead, then circled, and the hydrophone operator called out the bearing, and everyone in the boat held their breath and waited for the depth charges. But none came. The Liberator circled twice more, then flew away. Hartmann brought the boat back to periscope depth an hour later. The sea was empty. He surfaced, cautiously, and ordered the engineers to resume charging the batteries. But the fear did not leave him. He had been at sea since 1940. He had crossed the Atlantic 11 times. He had sunk 14 ships. He knew the patterns of war, the rhythms of hunter and hunted. This was new. This was wrong. The Liberator had come out of nowhere, dropped its flare with surgical precision, and circled as if it could see U-221 underwater. How? There was no moon, no stars, no possible way for the aircraft to have spotted the boat, unless they had a new kind of eyes. Hartmann wrote in his log that night, "I believe the enemy has perfected a method of detecting us in total darkness. If true, surface operations at night may no longer be feasible." He was not alone. Across the Atlantic, in the first 3 weeks of March 1943, 11 U-boats were surprised on the surface at night by aircraft they never saw coming. 5 were sunk. The others escaped, shaken, reporting the same impossible story. Darkness, silence, then sudden attack. On March 10, U-432 was caught southeast of Greenland and sunk with all hands. On March 12, U-444 was bombed in the North Atlantic. She survived, but her commander radioed back to Lorient. Aircraft appeared without warning, No visual or acoustic contact prior to attack. Radar suspected. On March 16, U-384 was depth-charged by a British destroyer that seemed to know exactly where she was, despite fog so thick the lookouts could not see the bow from the conning tower. On March 19, U-170 was bracketed by depth charges from an escort group that appeared out of nowhere. She went down in 3 minutes. 31 men died. 18 survived, pulled from the water by the destroyer HMS Vidette, and interrogated. They all said the same thing. We never saw them. We never heard them. They just knew. The wolf packs began to hesitate. Commanders who had once hunted with arrogance now surfaced with dread, knowing that the night was no longer theirs. The darkness that had been a cloak was now a shroud. Dönitz, reading the loss reports at his headquarters in Paris, felt the ground shift beneath him. He ordered his commanders to remain submerged as much as possible, to surface only when absolutely necessary, to avoid the Bay of Biscay, to scatter rather than concentrate. But a submarine that cannot surface cannot hunt. A submarine submerged is slow, 7 knots, maybe 8 too slow to chase convoys, too slow to escape escorts. The Wolfpack tactics depended on speed and surprise. Without the ability to run on the surface at night, the tactics collapsed. And still, the U-boats died. April 1943 was worse. 15 boats lost. Then, in May, the dam broke. In the first 3 weeks of May 1943, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, more than 1 per day. The U-boat fleet was not merely losing, it was being slaughtered. On May 4, U-209 was sunk by aircraft south of Iceland. On May 5, U-638 and U-531 went down in the North Atlantic. On May 6, U-438 was bombed and sunk. On May 11, U-528 was depth-charged to destruction. On May 12, U-89 and U-186 were lost. On May 13, U-266 was destroyed by a Catalina flying boat. On May 15, U-176 was rammed and sunk by a Cuban patrol boat off Havana. A Cuban patrol boat, a humiliation that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The breaking point came on the 24th of May 1943. Admiral Dönitz, staring at the casualty reports, made the decision that ended the Battle of the Atlantic. He recalled the wolf packs. All of them. Every operational U-boat in the North Atlantic was ordered to withdraw to safer waters. The order was terse, bitter, final. The situation in the North Atlantic has become untenable. Losses exceed any possible gain. All boats are to proceed to less threatened areas until new countermeasures can be developed. It was an admission of defeat. For the first time in the war, the U-boats had been driven from the sea. What the U-boat commanders felt in those months was not mere fear. Fear they knew. Fear was depravity and depth charges, pressure hull groaning, lights flickering, water spraying from cracked seams, the knowledge that you were 200 meters underwater in a steel coffin and one rivet failure would crush you like an insect. They had lived with that fear for years. What they felt now was something worse, the dissolution of certainty. They had believed the Atlantic was theirs. They had believed in their training, their boats, their tactics. They had believed they were the elite, the tip of the spear, the weapon that would win the war. And in less than 3 months, all of it had been revealed as illusion. They had expected the Allies to fight back, of course. They had expected new tactics, better escorts, improved sonar. What they had not expected was to be rendered obsolete. What they had not expected was to surface at night, and be found instantly, impossibly, as if the ocean itself had betrayed them. It was not a fair fight. It was extermination. Lieutenant Zur, C. Herbert Werner, a young officer aboard U-230, wrote in his memoir years later, "We felt like blind men hunted by wolves with perfect vision. Every time we surfaced, we knew we might die. not from bad luck or enemy skill, but from something we could not see, could not fight, could not understand. It was the worst kind of death by obsolescence. The psychological toll was immense. U-boat crews had always suffered. The casualty rate, even in the happy time, was brutal. Of the 39,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 28,000 died, a 72% fatality rate, the highest of any branch of any military in World War II. But in the early years, there had been a trade-off. High risk, yes, but also high glory. A successful patrol meant medals, leave, adulation. You were a hero. By the spring of 1943, that bargain had collapsed. Now it was just high risk. High risk and no reward. You went to sea, knowing the odds were against you. You went to sea, knowing you probably would not come back. And still they went. Because they were Germans, and Germans obeyed orders. Because they were sailors, and sailors did not refuse the sea. Because some still believed, even in May 1943, that the war could be won. But beneath the discipline and the duty, there was a question gnawing at their minds, a question they did not dare speak aloud. How? How had the Allies done this? How had they turned the Atlantic into a trap? What weapon, what technology, what stroke of genius or fortune had given them the power to see in the dark? The answer, when it finally came, was even more demoralizing than the losses. The first intact centimetric radar set fell into German hands in June 1943, recovered from a shot-down British bomber. Kriegsmarine technicians examined it with disbelief. The magnetron was smaller than a grapefruit. The radar could fit in a suitcase, and it could detect a surfaced U-boat from 15 kilometers away in total darkness. The engineers presented their findings to Admiral Dönitz, who read the report in silence, then set it down and said, quietly, "We have lost the Atlantic." But it was not just the radar. When the intelligence analysts compiled the full picture, the leylights, the escort carriers, the destroyer escorts, the sheer avalanche of Allied production, they realized they were not fighting a war. They were fighting an economy. Germany had 400 operational U-boats at the peak of the campaign. It sounded like a vast fleet, until you understood that America was building one destroyer escort every 3 days, one escort carrier every week. One Liberty ship 10,000 tons of cargo capacity every day. The Germans could sink a ship an hour, every hour, for a year, and still not outpace American shipyards. Dönitz had based his entire strategy on a calculation. If Germany could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve and America would be isolated. The calculation was correct. The premise was wrong. Germany could not sink ships faster than America could build them. No one could. The United States had entered the war with an industrial capacity larger than the rest of the world combined, and it had converted that capacity to war production with ruthless efficiency. Steel mills ran 3 shifts. Shipyards worked around the clock. Women who had never held a wrench became welders. Teenagers became crane operators. Henry Kaiser's Richmond shipyards reduced the time to build a Liberty ship from 230 days to 40 days. On the 12th of November 1942, they built one SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days and 15 hours, a publicity stunt that nonetheless proved the point. American production was not limited by resources or skill. It was limited only by imagination. And the Americans were very imaginative. The Germans had nothing to match it. The Ruhr was bombed. Resources were diverted to the Eastern Front. U-boat production was limited by steel shortages, labor shortages, and the Allied bombing campaign that turned shipyards into rubble. In 1943, Germany launched 270 new U-boats. It sounded impressive, until you realized that 244 U-boats were lost that same year. The fleet was shrinking, the men were dying, the war was slipping away. For the U-boat commanders, the revelation was crushing. They had thought they were warriors. They were, in fact, pawns. In an economic war they could not win. Skill did not matter. Courage did not matter. Sacrifice did not matter. The Allies had more. More ships, more planes, more radar sets, more steel, more oil, more men, more of everything. It was not a battle. It was arithmetic. Kapitan Lieutenant Eric Top, one of the top aces with 34 ships sunk, said it plainly in a post-war interview. "We were fighting America's factories, and you cannot sink a factory with a torpedo." There was a sound that haunted U-boat crews in the final 2 years of the war, a sound that came to symbolize everything they had lost. It was the sound of a liberator's engines. Deep, rhythmic, droning, the 4 right radials turning at 2,200 revolutions per minute, audible for miles across the water. In 1941, that sound had been rare, almost exotic, an enemy patrol plane, yes, but one with limited range, easily avoided. By 1943, it was constant. You heard it when you surfaced. You heard it when you recharged batteries. You heard it in your sleep, a phantom noise that woke you in a cold sweat. The Liberator was not the best aircraft of the war. It was not the fastest or the most elegant, but it had range 2,400 miles combat radius, enough to cover the mid-Atlantic, and it had radar, and it had ley lights, and there were hundreds of them. They closed the Black Pit. They ended the war of invisibility. The U-boat men called them Schlechter Butchers. When you heard the engines, you dived. When you dived, you lost the convoy. When you lost the convoy, you failed your mission. When you failed your mission, you went home with nothing, no tonnage, no kills, no glory, just the knowledge that next time the Liberator might catch you a few seconds slower, and you would die. The sound of those engines became the sound of defeat. But there was another sound, one the Germans did not hear until it was too late, one that represented something even more profound than technology or production. It was the sound of voices, dozens of them, hundreds of them, crackling over radio sets in a dozen languages, coordinating, cooperating, sharing information in real time. British operators at Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, tracking U-boat positions and radioing warnings to convoys. American cryptanalysts in Washington, breaking Enigma intercepts and passing them to the escorts. Canadian corvette captains in the North Atlantic, calling in air support from Newfoundland. It was the sound of an alliance, a coalition, a united effort that spanned oceans and continents and ideologies, bound together by a single principle. The Germans fought alone. Italy's navy was bottled up in the Mediterranean. Japan was 8,000 miles away, fighting its own war. The U-boats had no allies, no support, no one to call for help when the destroyers closed in and the depth charges began to fall. They were solitary hunters in a pack war, and the pack was larger than they had ever imagined. This was the lesson of the Atlantic. Technology matters, yes, but it is not enough. Production matters, but it is not enough. What wins wars is the ability to work together, to pool knowledge, to share sacrifice, to trust that the man beside you, even if he speaks a different language and prays to a different God, will stand with you when the night is darkest. The Allies had that, the Germans did not, and in the end, that made all the difference. By the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. U-boats still prowled the oceans, still sank ships, still claimed lives, but they were no longer a strategic threat. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with near impunity. Losses dropped from 100 ships a month to 20, then to 10. The Allies landed 1 million men in North Africa, then in Sicily, then in Italy, and the supplies flowed across the Atlantic in an unbroken stream. In 1944, the Allies would land 150,000 men on the beaches of Normandy, supported by 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft, and the U-boats would not be able to stop them. In the entire Normandy campaign, U-boats sank 5 ships. 5. It was a rounding error. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic for 3 years were gone. What remained were remnants, old boats, inexperienced crews, obsolete tactics. They fought on because they were ordered to, because surrender was unthinkable. because some still believed in the Führer's promises of wonder weapons and final victory. But the men who had lived through 1943 knew better. They knew they were dead men on borrowed time. Werner Hartmann, the commander who had surfaced in the darkness on March 17, survived the war. U-221 was sunk by depth charges on the 27th of September 1943 in the North Atlantic. Hartmann and 28 of his crew were rescued by the British destroyer HMS Orkis. In captivity, he was interviewed by Allied intelligence. They asked him when he knew the war was lost. March 1943, he said. The night the flare came down. I knew then. The darkness was gone, and we had nothing left to hide in. He was right. The war would grind on for another 2 years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Atlantic was closed. The U-boats were finished. And Germany, cut off from the resources it needed, bombed around the clock, invaded from east and west, would collapse into ruin. There is a small museum in Liverpool, in the basement of the old Western Approaches Command Centre, where the Battle of the Atlantic was coordinated. The walls are lined with maps, yellowed and fragile, dotted with pins that once marked convoys and U-boats, and battles that decided the fate of the world. In one corner, there is a display case containing a piece of equipment recovered from the Atlantic in 1945, a centimetric radar magnetron, corroded and cracked about the size of a fist. The placard beneath it reads, "This device helped win the war." It is a simple statement, but it captures a profound truth. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by heroism alone, though there was heroism in abundance. It was not won by sacrifice alone, though the sacrifice was immense. It was won by the marriage of ingenuity and industry, by the ability of free societies to innovate faster, produce more, and adapt better than their enemies. The magnetron was invented by scientists in a university laboratory, mass-produced by engineers in factories, and deployed by sailors and airmen who trusted the technology because they trusted the system that created it. It was a product of democracy, messy, chaotic, argumentative democracy, where ideas competed on merit and the best ideas won. The Germans had brilliant scientists too. They had skilled engineers, brave sailors, dedicated workers. What they did not have was a system that allowed those people to collaborate freely, to question orders, to innovate without fear. The U-boat force was rigid, hierarchical, bound by doctrine and ideology. When the tactics of 1939 stopped working in 1943, they could not adapt quickly enough. When the Allies deployed centimetric radar, it took the Germans 6 months to even understand what they were facing, and another year to develop countermeasures, by which time the Allies had moved on to the next innovation. This is the lesson that transcends the Battle of the Atlantic, the lesson that echoes through history. Tyranny is brittle. It can be efficient, yes, and brutal and terrifying, but it cannot compete over time with the creative chaos of freedom. Free people argue, debate, disagree, and in that friction, they find solutions that no single dictator, no matter how intelligent, can conceive. The Atlantic was closed, not by a single weapon or a single decision, but by 1,000 small innovations, 1,000 acts of cooperation, 1,000 people doing their jobs in a system that rewarded competence over ideology. Werner Hartmann lived to be 91 years old. He never went to sea again. In the last interview he gave, a year before his death, he was asked if he regretted his service. He paused for a long time before answering. "I regret the men who died," he said. "I regret the waste. I regret believing in something that was a lie. But I do not regret going to sea. The sea was honest. It did not care about flags or politics. It only cared about skill and luck, and in the end, the other side had more of both. He was wrong about one thing. The Allies did not have more luck. They had more freedom. And freedom, in the end, is the greatest force multiplier of all." The darkness returned to the Atlantic after the war, but it was a different darkness, peaceful, indifferent, eternal. The U-boats are still down there, dozens of them, lying in the cold black depths, tombs for the men who died believing they could win a war by sinking ships. They were wrong, but they were not cowards. They fought with everything they had, and they lost because they were on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of economics, and the wrong side of an idea, that free people, working together, are unstoppable. The flare that lit the sky over U-221 on the 17th of March 1943 burned for less than 3 minutes. But its light revealed a truth that would outlast the war, outlast the Reich, outlast every ideology that ever promised victory through conquest. In the end, the darkness always loses.